Hi, this is Nancy Rolfsma with On Point TV and Quilting with Nancy. We are into another segment of the Sunset Over Dublin quilt. So this is the Sunset Over Dublin quilt. Now this is just a quarter of it. We've had to fold it down. The one I made is 41 blocks, so it is a queen size quilt when I get the borders on. The instructions actually give you how many blocks you need to make for a crib size and a twin size too. So you can do lots of different things with it. At the very end of getting all the blocks made, I'll show you how to do the setting on point, which of course is my favorite way to set a quilt. So starting right off, we're going to be working on the Dutchman's puzzle. So if you're interested in following along, you can find the book for the Sunset Over Dublin on the website, onpoint-tv. That book and all of my other books and patterns are there, including my super cool pincushion. So maybe take a look. Oh, and Gina's super cool seam rippers and all. See, it goes one side is an awl, one side is a seam ripper. Love these things. Plus they're beautiful because they're done with a really pretty epoxy colors, lots of different colors. So with the Dutchman's puzzle, in the pattern, I do it all in the no waste technique for making a flying goose, but I'm going to show you both techniques. So we'll be doing two techniques in one block, kind of killing two birds with one stone. And we're going to start with what is called the connecting corners technique. Now, what I like about this technique is that it's the easiest one for me to figure out without charts and without math. I know that if I want my flying geese to be a finished 2x4, I just add a 1/2 inch to the measurement. So my rectangle starts out 2.5 by 4.5, and my squares start out 2.5 inches. Easy peasy. What I don't like about this technique is there will be some wasted fabric. So I'll show you one little trick that you can do so that you might be able to scavenge some really tiny half square triangles if you're like really creative. But this technique, good because you don't have to think really hard, bad because it does waste fabric. So let's get started. I have 4 rectangles cut, 2.5 by 4.5, and I have 8 rectangles cut that are 2.5 inches. Now you've got your choice as to how you want to create your stitching line. You can just draw a diagonal right down the middle. Keeping in mind with any connecting corners technique, you will be sewing on the line. Up till now, we've been sewing a scant 1/4 inch on either side. Connecting corners means on the line. So you can draw your line, but I'm going to show you another way that you can do the same thing without having to take the time to draw all those lines. And that is with a product called the diagonal seam tape. Now this comes from a company that's Cluck Cluck Sew. I don't know who they are, but I thought this was a pretty cool product that they came out with. And it comes with a roll of, I don't know how much is on there, a lot. The roll is going to have the 1/4 inch seam, a center seam, and another 1/4 inch seam. And you will take that and adhere that down onto your sewing machine table right here in the front. The red line, being the center line, needs to line up with your needle. So that's how I have mine set up. So the idea here is I'm going to start with the one that I've actually drawn the line on, so you'll see how this works. So placing it on the rectangle, you're going to sew on the diagonal line that I drew. Well, with the diagonal tape, I don't have to draw a line. If I look right down here, if I keep that point lined up on that center line, it'll be the same as drawing a diagonal line. So I'm going to do that on all 4 of these. One after another, going straight down the middle, nothing tricky here. When I'm done with these, I'm going to show you another additional seam you can do to save some fabric. Now what I'm going to do next is actually trim off this excess fabric. But what you can do if you're worried about all the wasted fabric is if you'll just take it and put it back in and now run a seam, so my needle is still in the middle. I'm going to run that stitched line that I just made on the left or right hand side, it really won't matter, all the way down, and I'll show you what you can get with that if you choose to do it this way. Oops, got to cut this little guy apart. All right, now going back to my ironing table, I have my 4 pieces done. Okay. So the idea is that now you're going to, I like to press them first, so that might seem a little confusing. Some people like to trim it and then press it, but this is how I like to do it. I've sewn that diagonal. I like to now press that seam up and then flip it back a little bit. I just think it makes it hold everything more secure. So for me, I press first and then I open it back up again and just trim that off. Now that was the wasted fabric I was telling you about. But this one is where I did 2 lines. I sewed the center seam and then just the foot distance apart. If you'll press that, again, do the pressing first. I guess I like to press it first because then I know that if it's covering everything, I've done it right. If I haven't, then something's wrong. But now when I cut this little guy, going right down the middle, this is that extra seam I sewed. So now I can flip that up and make a teeny tiny little half square triangle. So you can then turn these into whatever little crazy thing you want to make. You'd want to trim them because they don't usually come out square. I don't know why, they just don't. So that's something you can do if wasting that fabric bothers you. So let me get the rest of these pressed and trimmed, and then I'll show you what the next step is. So we're back making the connected corners flying geese, and here's the next step. Here's our first square is on. Simple as can be. You're going to place the second square on. And I'm going to go to my machine and sew that diagonal just like I did the first time and come back and show you the trimming and pressing and how to trim this maybe down to as close to perfect as possible. So using my diagonal seam tape again, I'm just going to start right at the very point of that corner and then line up this corner right on the red line of the diagonal seam tape. I found whenever I'm doing a connecting corners type of a project, this is gonna it saves time because you're just not having to take your time to draw that line. Now what it does not work for is very large pieces. If the square that you're sewing comes past the point and you can't see it, well, it kind of really doesn't work then because you really do need to see where that where that square is coming. So one more to go. Whoops, let's go this way. There we go. So they're not overlapping each other. Cut these apart, leave my leader where I need it next. Now when I cut these apart, the same idea. I want to set my seam, press that up, and then trim that off. When we come back, I'm going to show you how to use the Block Loc Flying Geese to trim these down. So I have the flying geese made that were done with the connecting corners. This is what I was talking about with all the wasted fabric. So there are a lot of those wasted, but if that bothers you, you can make those teeny tiny little guys. And this is one of my favorite rulers. Squaring up a flying geese has never been easy. The way to make it easy is to get the flying geese from Block Loc. The disadvantage to using the flying geese ruler from Block Loc as opposed to the half square triangle one. With the half square triangle, you could do all these different sizes, so many options. This is the greatest value in terms of rulers. With the flying goose one, it can only trim one size of flying geese. So it's not the most affordable thing, but it is really so very fabulous for trimming. I'm going to trim this one with it, but I'm going to do some more and show you how you can trim without it also. All right. So the idea with the Flying Goose from Block Loc, it has the diagonal right here. So that means you just put that right into the nose of the goose, just like that. Now, these actually turned out pretty darn close to spot on, but there is some trimming I can do. A little bit here, going to spin them around. A little bit here, and I'm done. All right. So because these were cut just the size they needed to be, there's not that much to trim. I'm going to show you another technique now called the no waste flying geese method. Now what I love about this is exactly what it says. There's no waste. There's no leftover fabrics. I also like that you can cut the pieces a little bit bigger, and then using the Block Loc will really help trim them down fast. So this is how it goes. You're going to start with a 5.5-inch square of fabric. Keep in mind, during the process of this, if you have never seen it before, you're going to think I know magic, because it just blows my mind how at the end of this I have 4 flying geese. So start with one large square. Now I like to cut mine a little larger than it needs to be, so I'm going to use mine at 5.5 inches. And my squares, the small squares that I put on top, I'm going to cut those 3 inches. Line them up so that the drawn line, so I draw a diagonal line, is running, and see how they're right here together running in one long line, and then put a pin there to hold on to that as you then go to your sewing machine. Now at my sewing machine, because I'm going to be having the fabric go all the way through, and this is a large square, I cannot utilize the diagonal seam tape that's on here, but I'm going to leave it there because we will use it when we're constructing the block together. So I've drawn the line and I moved my needle over so that it's the scant 1/4 inch from the edge. Now keep in mind, you might notice that I'm always talking about the scant 1/4 inch, but then I'm trimming all the blocks down anyway. You know, it's just a way to try and get your scant 1/4 inch perfected, because when you're constructing the block, you do have to have that. The truth is with this, if you did not have your scant 1/4 inch, that'd be okay. We're going to trim them down a little bit anyway. Then we're going to sew on the other side of that line. Now this is definitely the technique I like to use if I'm making a lot of flying geese. It just seems to go pretty quick because there are all these long lines. Oops, I forgot to cut that off. There we go, coming to the end. I'm going to sew them right back on again. There you go. All right, back to the pressing and the ironing board. I'm going to start by pressing it flat. That's going to make that friction pen disappear. But I know that that little cutting line was right there in the middle. Then I'm going to cut that in half. And this is where the magic really starts to happen, because does anything there look to you like it's going to be a flying goose? Doesn't to me, and I didn't believe it until I actually started doing it. We're going to now take and press these small triangles up. And the small triangles are the outside triangles of the geese. All right? So you've got 2 of those. Now I did do, in the very beginning, I had spray sized all of my pieces. So I love how it really helps everything stay really, really crisp. All right. Now we take these rather strange shaped units back to our table, and we take the remaining squares and place them on. And when you know that this is right, when you see that the drawn line is going right between the 2 triangles that you first put on, and you'll be making 2 of these. Now maybe you can see how the flying goose is going to work now. So back to our sewing machine. Using the same seam allowances I had before, I'm going to sew on the diagonal. And we're going to do 2 of them. Cut those apart. And sew on the other side. Back to the ironing board. Gonna press these. And cut them in half. And then be prepared to be marveled and amazed. When you press that up, you have a flying goose. It's really quite magical. Now, the idea here is that if you were doing the traditional, most basic way of making flying geese, you would have taken that large square and cut it on the diagonal twice, and then you would have taken the small squares and cut those on the diagonal once, and so you'd have been piecing with large bias edge triangles. Now, there are some times that you have to do that. There are some times that the block maybe only needs 1 or 2 of the flying geese. Well, it kind of would make no sense to make 4 of these, or you could use the connecting corners technique with the wasted fabric, but there are different ways to do it. This way, by far, my favorite way when I need to make at least 4. Now I take my Block Loc ruler. Keeping in mind, I cut those a little larger than I needed to be. When I set that into the place, look at that. I can trim off these edges. And I have a perfect flying goose, just the size I need him. I'm going to get these all trimmed, and then we'll come back together and put the block together. So I have my 8 flying geese ready, and this block is made in quadrants. So all the quadrants are exactly the same, with the dark flying geese on the bottom and the light flying geese on the top. You're going to take these to your sewing machine, flipping the light over, and then we'll sew on this seam. Now, when you're sewing on this seam, what you want to be paying attention to is the X that is created by the thread, because you want to sew right through that X, not too far. Oh, and I'm using the diagonal seam tape. I'm going to use the 1/4 inch guide there. Oops, wait a minute. I got to put my needle back into position up. I'm going to do that. All right, so to do this with the seam tape, you have to have your needle in the middle. So there, I'm with the needle in the middle, and the edge of my units is going to be riding right on the edge of that 1/4 inch mark of the diagonal seam tape, and I'm going to be trying to aim right for that crisscross. So let's start that again. Right, match them up, right here where those crisscross. So if you have the edge of your unit right there on the edge of the 1/4 inch seam that's on the diagonal seam tape, you should be running just as close to the middle of that intersection as possible. And you've got 4 of these to make for this block. They're all done. When you press them, you want to try to press them to the point of least resistance. And honestly, with 2 flying geeses going together, there isn't any easy way to make that happen. Oh, I did want to mention the Flying Goose Block Loc ruler is available on firesidequilts.com. So that's a great place to get them and help my friend Laura out. All right. So when you're pressing these, I always want to say to the point of least resistance, but do you see how these side seams are fighting me? They want to go down. This one wants to go up. I find it best to have them go up so that the bulk of the nose, I guess I would consider that the nose of the goose, he's always pointing up, because if you bring him down, it is so bulky right there in the middle. So when possible, press that up. So if I want to press it toward the top goose, I'm going to start with the top goose on top, set that seam, and then flip it up. So now I've got 1 of my quadrants done. I need 4 of these pressed just like that. And you can see by sewing right through the intersection on the unit right there, that's how I get those points to be right there. If you sew past that too far to the left, you will end up cutting off the nose of your goose, and that's just not a good idea. There we go. All 4 quadrants done. Now this block is called the Dutchman's puzzle. Why it's called the Dutchman's puzzle, I don't know, but my husband is Dutch, so that's why I wanted to be sure that I included the Dutchman's puzzle. So there you go. That's how it's going to construct. So I'm going to make this be the first row. Now when you're working on this, keep in mind this seam is pressed toward the black fabric. This seam is pressed toward the black fabric. So when those go together, they're going to snuggle right together, going in opposite directions. I'm going to pin that in place. Do the same thing with the one on the bottom. Snuggles right together. So this makes a cool little pinwheel right in the middle. So now going to our sewing machine. Again, I'm going to use the 1/4 inch of the diagonal seam tape as my seam guide. My needle is in the middle. There we go. Chain piece this one. When you press these, trying to find the point of least resistance is going to get these to press this way. So this bulk is going into where there's no bulk there. So that means I want it pressed to this fabric. That means I'm going to start with that fabric on the top, set the seam, and then flip it up. And with a quadrant block, that means that both rows are exactly the same. So I'm going to just start that again with that one on top. Press that up. Now this flips over, and that'll make my quilt block. Putting those together, the seams are in opposite directions. I'm going to pin that to keep that center, which is the most important part. And I'm not going to pin the other ones. Those will kind of fall into place. Sewing with my scant 1/4 inch seam allowance from the diagonal tape. There's that intersection. I want to be sure that I don't go too far to the left of that intersection. I want to go right down the middle of that intersection. Right there. There we go. I'm going to set that first, and then we're going to make that do the spin. So have that open up there. Sometimes looks like I need to use my seam ripper a little bit on this one. Kind of help separate that. Just plucking the threads out. I am not cutting the threads. I want to keep the length of the thread there, but you can just kind of pluck them out a little bit until you get that seam to open up. And then press it, and so it's kind of like one of the big pinwheels that we've been making. Look at that beautiful block. All right. Now all of these blocks should be measuring 8.5 inches at this point. So let's talk a little bit about trimming them again. So if I look at this block, ooh, he actually is 8.5 from end to end. And from here, yeah, he's 8.5 inches. I'm not going to do any trimming. If I wanted to, I would not square up the block. I would trim it, making sure that those points are at least 1/4 inch from the edge, so I can trim off that little tiny bit there, only looking at the right hand edge. Don't try to square up the block, just keeping those points 1/4 inch from the edge. There we go. I trimmed off, 3 or 4 little slivers off of this block. But that does make him even look a little bit cooler. So that's a beautiful Dutchman's puzzle block. So when we get together next time, we'll be doing a chevron unit, which is going to be very similar to the flying goose with a couple of little tricks in there, of course. Be sure that you've subscribed to the channel and hit that notifications button. There's a lot of parts to this Sunset over Dublin quilt. You don't want to miss any of them. And like I mentioned earlier, the book is available on the website onpoint-tv. If you have any questions, please contact me at quiltingwithnancy@gmail.com. We'll see you next time.